when the Galactic Combat Academy's most arrogant elite trainee, Zar'keth from the warrior planet Veltari, decides to test the Academy's new human exchange student Maya Chen during combat training by grabbing her hair. He expects her to crumble like every other species. Instead, she responds by literally ripping his spine out through his back while he's still talking. What follows is a darkly comedic tale of galactic politics gone wrong. As the Academy scrambles to cover up the incident, Maya becomes an overnight legend, and Zar'keth learns that humans don't just fight dirty, they redefine what excessive force means entirely. The Galactic Combat Academy floated in the void like a massive steel tumor, bristling with weapon arrays and training facilities that could reduce entire moons to cosmic dust. For 3 centuries it had been the premier institution where the galaxy's finest warriors came to learn the art of civilized violence. Well, civilized by galactic standards anyway. Zar'keth of House Veltari stood at the observation deck, his 4 arms crossed in a display of casual superiority that had taken him years to perfect. At 8 feet tall, with chitinous plates covering his purple-hued skin and mandibles that clicked when he was particularly pleased with himself, which was often he represented everything the Academy stood for. Elite breeding, superior genetics, and a combat record that made lesser species wet themselves in terror. Another batch of weaklings, he muttered to his companion, Kexara, whose serpentine neck swayed as she nodded agreement. Her species, the Silthani, were known for their venomous bite and complete lack of empathy, making her the perfect audience for Zar'keth's daily dose of arrogance. The transport vessels were docking in the main bay below, disgorging their cargo of fresh recruits from across the galaxy. Zar'keth's compound eyes tracked each species with the bored interest of a predator watching prey. Korthak warriors from the death world of Grimhaven, decent fighters, but predictable. Several Zephyrian scouts, all wings and hollow bones, fast but fragile. A few Bruthan heavies, built like living siege engines but with the tactical awareness of particularly aggressive furniture. Wait, Kixara's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. What is that pathetic creature? Zar'keth's attention focused on a transport from the Outer Rim territories. A small figure emerged, barely reaching 5.5 feet in height, with pale pink skin and the most ridiculous covering of fur on top of its skull. 2 arms, 2 legs, no natural armor, no visible weapons, no enhanced muscle mass, just a walking illustration of evolutionary failure. Human, Zar'keth said, his mandibles clicking with amusement, from that backwater mudball they call Earth. Apparently, they think they belong here now that they've learned to build starships without them exploding, most of the time. The human female Maya Chen, according to the manifest Zar'keth had memorized to better mock his inferiors, walked with what he could only describe as casual confidence. She wore the standard academy training uniform, which on her looked like a child playing dress-up in her parents' military gear. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple knot, and she carried herself with the easy stride of someone who had never faced real danger. Other recruits were already giving her a wide berth, not out of respect but out of the kind of embarrassed pity one shows for a creature too stupid to realize it's about to die. The Korthaks snorted through their breathing slits, the Zephyrians chittered nervously, and the Bruthans just stared with the blank confusion of beings trying to process something that didn't fit their worldview. This will be entertaining, Zar'keth mused, already planning how he would break this fragile little creature during their first training session. The humans sent their military's finest, and this is what they chose. I've seen more intimidating moss. Kixara's neck coiled with anticipation. Perhaps we should make an example of it early, show the others what happens to species that overestimate themselves. Oh, I intend to, Zar'keth replied, his 4 hands flexing with practiced menace. Combat training begins in 1 standard hour, perfect timing to demonstrate why the Academy maintains its standards. Below them, Maya Chen had found her assigned quarters, and was apparently unpacking with the same methodical efficiency she showed in everything else. She paused occasionally to examine the Academy's architecture with what looked like professional interest, making notes on a small device that probably couldn't survive a sneeze from most species present. The other recruits were settling into the familiar rhythms of military hierarchy, the strong asserting dominance, the weak seeking protection, and everyone else calculating where they fit in the inevitable pecking order. It was a dance as old as civilization itself, played out across 1,000 species and 1,000,000 worlds. What none of them realized, as they prepared for their first lesson in galactic warfare, was that they were about to receive an education in human combat doctrine. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, It was teaching lessons that no one ever forgot. Assuming, of course, they survived long enough to remember them. The Academy's primary training hall resembled a gladiatorial arena designed by committee, which, knowing Galactic bureaucracy, it probably was. Reinforced walls surrounded a combat pit large enough to accommodate the Academy's more physically impressive species, while observation galleries allowed instructors to watch their students attempt to murder each other with educational enthusiasm. Instructor Vector, a grizzled Thoraxian veteran whose carapace bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, surveyed the assembled recruits with the weary contempt of someone who had seen too many young warriors die stupid deaths. His 6 legs clicked against the metal flooring as he paced, compound eyes taking in each student's stance, equipment, and general likelihood of survival. Today, Vector announced in his gravelly voice, "We begin close-quarters combat assessment. You will be paired randomly. The objective is simple: disable your opponent using non-lethal force. Medical teams are standing by for the inevitable casualties." The random pairing system, like most Academy technology, had been designed by the lowest bidder and maintained by whoever was available. It matched beings based on complex algorithms involving body mass, reaction time, and species-specific combat ratings. Unfortunately, it also had a sense of humor that leaned heavily toward irony. Zar'keth of House Veltari, the system announced with mechanical indifference, paired with Maya Chen of Earth. The snickers that rippled through the observation galleries would have been audible from orbit. This wasn't a pairing, it was a scheduled execution with educational value. Zar'keth's mandibles clicked with barely contained glee as he flexed all 4 arms, his chitinous plates shifting to allow maximum range of motion. Across the pit, Maya Chen checked her equipment with the methodical precision of a technician running a diagnostic. "Poor little human," Kexara whispered from the gallery above. "I almost feel sorry for it." Zar'keth stepped into the combat circle, his 8-foot frame casting a shadow over his opponent. Maya moved to her position with the same casual efficiency she had shown earlier, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was about to be dismantled by a warrior whose species had been perfecting the art of violence since before humans had invented agriculture. "Begin combat assessment," Vector commanded, his translator rendering the words with bureaucratic precision. For a moment, neither combatant moved. Maya stood with her hands at her sides, weight balanced, watching Zar'keth with the kind of patient attention one might give to an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. Zar'keth, meanwhile, was savoring the moment. This was going to be educational for everyone involved. "You know, little human," Zar'keth said, beginning his traditional pre-combat intimidation routine, "I almost admire your species' optimism. Sending someone like you to train alongside real warriors shows either incredible courage or complete stupidity." Maya tilted her head slightly, as if genuinely considering the distinction. Zar'keth began circling, all 4 arms weaving in the complex patterns of Veltari combat dance. "I promise to make this quick. Your fragile little bones will snap so easily, I might not even notice when—" He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, closing the distance between them in a blur of chitinous plates and corded muscle. His plan was simple: grab the human by that ridiculous fur on her head, lift her off the ground and hold her there while delivering his traditional victory speech. It would be humiliating, educational, and thoroughly entertaining for the audience. His upper right hand shot out and grasped Maya's hair, fingers tangling in the dark strands as he prepared to lift her like a particularly disappointing trophy. The texture was surprisingly coarse, not at all like the fine filaments of civilized species, and he was just opening his mandibles to deliver another cutting remark when the universe suddenly developed a very specific and immediate problem. Maya's left hand moved with a precision that defied physics, slipping between Zar'keth's chitinous plates at a point where no gap should have existed. Her fingers found the cluster of nerve endings at the base of his primary spinal column, and then with the casual efficiency of someone opening a particularly stubborn jar, she grabbed his spine and pulled. The wet, grinding sound of vertebrae separating from their moorings filled the training hall with acoustic horror. Zar'keth's vocal cords produced a noise that no Veltari throat was designed to make, a sound that somehow managed to convey surprise, agony, and profound existential confusion all in a single, ascending shriek. His spine came out through his back with the organic inevitability of evolution running in reverse. Maya held it up for a moment, examining it with the clinical interest of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray, before dropping it on the training mat with a wet slap that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Zar'keth, meanwhile, was discovering what it felt like to exist as a mostly empty biological container. His compound eyes tracked the ceiling with the glassy stare of someone processing information his brain refused to accept. His mandibles moved soundlessly, trying to form words in a throat that was no longer connected to anything useful. "Huh," Maya said, wiping her hand on her uniform with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything else. "I thought you guys were supposed to be tougher than that." The silence that followed was the kind of complete, profound quiet that usually preceded either religious revelation or thermonuclear warfare. Every being in the training hall, student, instructor, and medical staff stared at the small human who had just performed impromptu spinal surgery on the Academy's most feared cadet. Zar'keth's body hit the floor with the hollow thump of empty armor, his nervous system having finally accepted that it was no longer a going concern. His compound eyes continued to track movement with the stubborn persistence of biology refusing to acknowledge reality. Maya looked around the training hall, noting the expressions of shock, horror, and dawning comprehension on dozens of alien faces. "So," she said in the tone of someone making polite conversation at a dinner party, "who's next?" The first being to move was Medic Thalvan, a Quillarian whose species had evolved specifically to deal with battlefield trauma. His 4 eye stalks swiveled independently as he approached the scene, scanning for vital signs, blood loss patterns, and general structural integrity. What he found challenged every principle of emergency medicine he had learned in 2 decades of patching up galactic warriors. "By the 7 moons of Quillis," Thalvan whispered, his translator struggling with the theological implications. "How is he still conscious?" Zar'keth's compound eyes tracked the medic's movement with the glassy persistence of someone whose brain hadn't quite caught up with recent anatomical developments. His mandibles moved in what might have been an attempt at speech, producing only a wet clicking sound that suggested his vocal cords were no longer receiving proper neural input. "The spine is completely intact," Thalvan announced to his medical team, holding up the extracted vertebral column like evidence in a particularly disturbing court case. "Every vertebra, every disc, every nerve bundle, it's all here." She removed his entire spinal column without damaging any of the surrounding tissue. His assistant, a nervous chiropteran named Skrit, fluttered his wings in agitation. "That's impossible. The precision required would take a surgical team hours with the finest equipment." "Apparently," Thalvan replied, examining the spine with professional fascination, "humans have different ideas about what constitutes surgical precision." Across the training mat, Maya was answering Instructor Vektar's increasingly frantic questions with the patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. "You pulled out his spine," Vektar stated, his 6 legs clicking against the floor in a rhythm that suggested impending nervous breakdown. "Yes," Maya confirmed. "Through his back. That's generally where spines are located." While he was talking, Maya shrugged. "He was boring me. Plus he grabbed my hair, which is considered assault in most human jurisdictions." Vektar's compound eyes bulged with the effort of processing this information. In 3 decades of military instruction, he had seen cadets lose limbs, suffer severe burns, and occasionally explode in spectacular fashion during weapons training. But he had never seen someone perform elective neurosurgery as a response to mild social rudeness. "The medical team is trying to determine if reattachment is possible," he said, grasping for some semblance of normal procedure. "Good luck with that," Maya replied, wiping her hands on a towel with the casual efficiency of someone finishing a particularly messy meal. "Human anatomy classes cover vertebrate manipulation. Your boy there has a completely different neural architecture than anything we've studied. I'm honestly surprised it came out in one piece." In the observation gallery, the other cadets were processing the incident according to their respective species' psychological frameworks. The Korthax, whose culture revolved around honorable combat, stared with the stunned silence of beings whose entire worldview had just been surgically extracted and discarded. The Zephyrians had stopped chittering entirely, their hollow bones trembling with frequencies that suggested they were reconsidering their life choices. The Bruthans, meanwhile, were slowly backing away from the gallery railing with the careful deliberation of creatures who had just realized they were no longer at the top of the food chain. "Did you see how fast she moved?" whispered Cadet Yuxtal, a Silthani scout whose serpentine neck coiled with nervous energy. "I've got enhanced reflexes, and I didn't even see her hand move until the spine was already out." "Forget the speed," muttered Grokvar, a Bruthan heavy whose species was known for their tactical analysis. "Look at the technique. She knew exactly where to grab, exactly how much force to apply, Exactly which angle would cause complete separation without secondary tissue damage. That wasn't luck, that was precision. Cadet Limara, whose people had evolved from pack hunters, was staring at Maya with the kind of horrified respect usually reserved for natural disasters. She didn't even check if he was armed, didn't scan for backup weapons, didn't assess his combat stance, didn't do any preliminary threat analysis. She just ended him. While he was talking, Yuxtal added, her voice carrying the tone of someone trying to convince herself this was all some elaborate hallucination. Down in the training pit, Academy Administrator Rexnall had arrived with the kind of bureaucratic panic that suggested he was already calculating the diplomatic ramifications. His species, the Zentauri, were natural bureaucrats whose entire civilization revolved around filling out forms in triplicate and avoiding responsibility whenever possible. This is a disaster, Rexnall announced, his tentacles writhing with administrative anxiety. The Veltari Confederation will demand an investigation. The Academy's reputation is at stake. The insurance claims alone will bankrupt us. Maya looked up from cleaning her fingernails, apparently unaware that she had just triggered what might become the galaxy's first interspecies diplomatic incident over spinal extraction. Is there a problem? The exercise called for disabling the opponent using non-lethal force. Zar'keth is disabled, and technically he's still alive. You removed his spine. Rexnall's tentacles flailed with increasing urgency. Non-lethally, Maya pointed out, his brain function appears intact, and his autonomic systems are still operating. By human medical standards, this would be classified as severe but survivable trauma. Instructor Vector's mandibles clicked with the sound of someone's sanity hanging by a thread. Human medical standards? What kind of injuries do your species consider normal? Maya considered this question with the thoughtful expression of someone trying to translate a complex technical concept into layman's terms. Well, we've had soldiers continue fighting after losing limbs. Civilians survive building collapses that should have liquefied them, and athletes compete with injuries that would hospitalize most sentient species. Humans are surprisingly difficult to kill permanently. Permanently? Medic Thalvan looked up from his increasingly futile attempts to determine if Zar'keth's spine could be reattached. What does that mean, permanently? Oh, you know, Maya said with a casual wave. We tend to bounce back from things that would be fatal to other species. It's probably an evolutionary adaptation from living on a death world. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the soft thudding sound of Administrator Rexnall fainting, his bureaucratic nervous system finally accepting that this situation was far beyond the scope of standard Academy incident reports. Maya looked around at the assembled aliens, medical staff paralyzed by professional horror, instructors questioning their career choices, and cadets reconsidering their fundamental assumptions about the nature of combat, and sighed with the patience of someone dealing with particularly slow children. So, she said, checking the Academy's standard chronometer, are we continuing with combat assessment, or should I report to my next class? The Emergency Council chamber aboard the Academy had been designed to accommodate diplomatic crises, territorial disputes, and the occasional declaration of war between member species. What it had not been designed for was explaining why a human cadet had performed impromptu spinal surgery on the galaxy's most politically connected military trainee. Ambassador Kethran of the Veltari Confederation stood at the head of the conference table, his forearms gesticulating with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was 2 diplomatic protocols away from declaring a holy war. His mandibles clicked with mechanical precision as he addressed the assembled representatives, each click carefully calibrated to convey maximum political outrage. This is an act of barbarism, Kethran declared, his translator rendering his words with bureaucratic efficiency. My nephew was brutally assaulted by this primitive creature from an uncivilized world. Across the table, human ambassador Sarah Martinez maintained the kind of diplomatic smile that had been perfected during centuries of international relations. Her species might be new to galactic politics, but they had learned the art of politely disagreeing while simultaneously preparing for total war. With respect, Ambassador Kethran, Martinez replied, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had dealt with far worse situations during her tenure as Earth's diplomatic representative. Your nephew initiated physical contact during a sanctioned training exercise. By Academy protocols, Cadet Chen was well within her rights to respond with appropriate force. Appropriate force? Kethran's voice climbed several octaves, a sound that made the other species' representatives check their universal translators for malfunction. She removed his spine. How is spinal extraction considered appropriate? Academy Director Velshan, whose species specialized in conflict resolution through bureaucratic exhaustion, cleared his throat with the sound of gravel being processed through a cement mixer. Perhaps we should hear from the cadet herself. Understanding her perspective might help us reach a mutually acceptable resolution. Maya Chen sat at the far end of the conference table with the relaxed posture of someone attending a particularly boring staff meeting. She had changed out of her training uniform into the Academy's formal diplomatic attire, which somehow made her look even more incongruous among the assembled alien dignitaries. Cadet Chen, Director Velshan began with the careful tone of someone approaching an unexploded ordnance. Could you explain your actions during the training exercise? Sure, Maya replied with the matter-of-fact delivery that had been causing diplomatic incidents since her arrival. Target grabbed my hair, which constitutes assault under Earth military regulations. I responded with the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. Ambassador Catherine's mandibles locked in position, producing a grinding sound that suggested his jaw muscles were calculating the physics of Maya's statement. Minimum force? You extracted his spinal column. Non-lethally, Maya emphasized, apparently missing the distinction that was causing Catherine's diplomatic training to short-circuit. I could have crushed his primary neural cluster, severed his breathing tubes, or collapsed his thoracic cavity. The spine extraction was actually quite restrained. The silence that followed this explanation carried the weight of several civilizations, reconsidering their fundamental assumptions about human combat doctrine. Ambassador Threxval of the Korthak Federation, whose people had built their entire culture around honorable warfare, stared at Maya with the expression of someone watching their religion being casually dismantled by a child with a particularly dangerous set of building blocks. What? Threxval asked in the tone of someone afraid of the answer. Would you consider maximum force? Maya tilted her head thoughtfully. Well, human military doctrine recognizes several escalation levels. Level 1 is non-lethal disabling, which is what I used. Level 2 involves permanent injury, but survival probability above 60%. Level 3 is lethal force with collateral damage mitigation. Level 4 drops the mitigation requirements. And Level 5? Director Velshan asked, though his expression suggested he was already regretting the question. There is no Level 5, Maya replied. After Level 4 we generally just skip to orbital bombardment. The diplomatic silence that greeted this revelation was broken by the soft thud of Ambassador Catherine's unconscious body hitting the conference table. His nervous system had apparently decided that the current conversation exceeded its operational parameters and initiated an emergency shutdown. Perhaps, Ambassador Martinez suggested with the diplomatic grace of someone who had been expecting this conversation since humanity joined the Galactic Council, we should review the Academy's combat protocols to ensure they accommodate different species' cultural approaches to conflict resolution. Maya nodded approvingly. That makes sense. Most of the other cadets seem really fragile. I was actually holding back quite a bit during the exercise. Director Velshan's throat sac inflated with what might have been either a diplomatic cough or an early warning sign of complete mental breakdown. Holding back? Oh yeah, Maya said, warming to the topic with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a hobby. Human combat training emphasizes adaptability to different threat levels. Against an unknown alien physiology, standard protocol calls for minimal force application until you can assess structural weaknesses and optimal termination points. Termination points? This came from Ambassador Crixtel of the Silthani Republic, whose serpentine neck had coiled into what her species considered a defensive posture. You know, the spots where you can disable an opponent most efficiently. Every species has them. Neural clusters, breathing apparatus, structural support systems. Humans are trained to identify and exploit these vulnerabilities within the first few seconds of combat engagement. Maya paused, apparently noticing the horrified expressions around the conference table. Is that not normal? How do other species conduct warfare? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, carrying implications that every diplomat present was desperately trying not to consider. Finally, Ambassador Martinez spoke with the careful precision of someone diffusing a particularly complicated explosive device. Perhaps, she suggested, we should schedule some cross-cultural combat seminars to promote better understanding between species. Director Velshan looked around the conference table, taking in the unconscious Veltari ambassador, the catatonic Korthak representative, and the human cadet who had just casually described military doctrines that would give nightmares to veteran shock troops. Yes, he said in the tone of someone accepting the inevitable. I think that would be educational. Within 6 standard hours, the incident had propagated through the Galactic communication network with the viral efficiency of a particularly aggressive plague. The Academy's attempts at information containment had failed spectacularly, primarily because the medical staff couldn't stop talking about the impossible surgery, and the diplomatic corps couldn't stop filing increasingly frantic reports with their respective governments. The first news outlet to pick up the story was the Centauri Broadcasting Network, whose sensationalist approach to journalism had made them the galaxy's primary source of entertainment disguised as information. Their headline, "Human Cadet Performs Battlefield Surgery on Elite Warrior During Training Exercise," managed to be both technically accurate and completely misleading, which was exactly the kind of editorial achievement their species had perfected over centuries of bureaucratic evolution. By the 8th hour, every major civilization in the galaxy had issued official statements regarding the spine incident, as it was being called in diplomatic circles. The responses varied according to each species' cultural relationship with violence, but they all shared a common theme of profound concern about humanity's place in the galactic community. The Korthak Federation's military council had gone into emergency session, where Fleet Commander Graktul was addressing his staff with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for extinction-level threats. Our intelligence was incomplete, he admitted, his scarred carapace clicking with nervous energy. We assessed human combat capabilities based on their primitive technology and small physical stature. We did not account for their innovative approach to warfare. His aide, a younger warrior named Brektal, fluttered his wing membranes uncertainly. Sir, our combat doctrine emphasizes honor and direct confrontation. How do we counter an enemy that considers spinal extraction a minimal force response? We don't. Graktul replied with the flat certainty of someone who had spent decades studying warfare. We negotiate, carefully. Similar conversations were taking place across the galaxy. The Silthani Republic's Assassination Guild had called an unprecedented emergency meeting, where Master Assassin Yustal was explaining to her disciples why their traditional techniques might need revision. Our methods rely on stealth, precision, and intimate knowledge of target physiology, she hissed, her forked tongue flicking with agitation. The humans appear to combine all three into a single, instantaneous action. This suggests they may be natural assassins, who simply haven't realized it yet. Her most promising student raised a tentative question. Master, should we consider recruiting humans for advanced training? The silence that followed this suggestion was broken only by the sound of several senior assassins quietly updating their retirement plans. Meanwhile, in the Academy's medical wing, Zar'keth was experiencing what the medical staff euphemistically called recovery complications. The surgical reattachment of his spine had been successful from a purely technical standpoint. Every vertebra was properly aligned, every nerve connection restored, every muscle group reattached. Unfortunately, nobody had consulted his psychological well-being during the procedure. The physical trauma was extensive but repairable, Medic Thalvin explained to the psychiatric assessment team. The mental trauma, however, appears to be ongoing. Zar'keth sat on his medical bed, staring at the wall with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose worldview had been surgically extracted along with his spine. His mandibles moved occasionally, forming soundless words that the psychiatric monitors couldn't quite decode. What is he saying? Asked Dr. Milak Sara, the Academy's chief psychiatrist. Thalvin adjusted his translation equipment and leaned closer. He keeps repeating, "She pulled out my spine," over and over. Sometimes he adds, "while I was talking," but mostly it's just, "she pulled out my spine." Has he said anything else? Yesterday he asked if humans eat spines. We assured him they don't, but he didn't seem convinced. The psychological impact wasn't limited to Zar'keth. Throughout the Academy, cadets were displaying symptoms of what the medical staff had termed human anxiety disorder, a condition characterized by hypervigilance around human personnel, nervous tics when Chen was mentioned, and a tendency to check the structural integrity of their own spinal columns when they thought nobody was looking. Cadet Limara had developed the habit of wearing extra armor to training sessions, despite the fact that armor had proved completely irrelevant to Maya's surgical technique. When questioned about this behavior, she could only respond, "She pulled out his spine," through his armor, while he was talking. Other species were implementing their own protective measures. The Bruthan hegemony had issued new military protocols requiring their soldiers to maintain minimum safe distances from human personnel, The Zephyrian scouts had redesigned their combat formations to account for human proximity variables. The Thoraxian Confederation had simply moved all their military installations to the opposite side of the galaxy from Earth. Through all of this galactic upheaval, Maya Chen continued her academy training with the serene obliviousness of someone completely unaware that she had fundamentally altered interspecies relations. She attended her tactical theory classes, participated in weapons training, and studied galactic military history with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else. "How's your integration with the other cadets going?" Instructor Vector asked during her weekly evaluation, his 6 legs clicking nervously against the floor. "Pretty well," Maya replied, apparently not noticing that other cadets now gave her a minimum berth of 20 meters during all activities. "Everyone's been very respectful, much more polite than I expected from military personnel." Vector's compound eyes tracked her with the wary attention of someone monitoring a natural disaster. "And you're finding the Academy's training standards?" "Oh sure," Maya said with cheerful enthusiasm. "Though I have to say, the combat protocols seem really gentle. Back home, our basic training was much more intensive." The clicking of Vector's legs stopped abruptly, as if his nervous system had decided that processing this information exceeded safe operational parameters. "More intensive?" he asked, though his expression suggested he was already regretting the question. "Well, yeah," Maya said, warming to the topic. "This is just preliminary assessment stuff, right? When do we get to the advanced techniques?" 3 months after what historians would later call the Spine Incident, the Galactic Combat Academy had implemented what they diplomatically termed enhanced safety protocols for human integration. The reality was somewhat less diplomatic. Maya Chen now trained in a specially reinforced facility, with medical teams on permanent standby, and a minimum safe distance requirement that made her combat sessions look like ritualistic demonstrations of controlled violence. The Academy's new Human Cadet Manual ran to 400 pages and included helpful chapters like recognizing early warning signs of human combat escalation, emergency spine reattachment procedures, and psychological support for witnesses to human training exercises. The appendix contained a comprehensive list of phrases that should never be used around human personnel, including "fight me," "bring it on," and the surprisingly problematic "good morning." Director Vel Shon stood in his office, reviewing the Academy's latest enrollment statistics with the weary resignation of someone who had watched his career transform from military education to crisis management. Human cadet applications had increased by 3,000%, while applications from every other species had dropped to levels not seen since the plague wars of the 3rd millennium. "We've created a monster," he muttered to his aide, who nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who had been nodding in agreement for 3 straight months. "Sir," the aide ventured, "the other academies are reporting similar trends. Apparently every military in the galaxy wants human exchange students now." "Of course they do," Veilshan replied, his throat sac deflating with bureaucratic exhaustion. "Nothing says diplomatic deterrent like having soldiers who consider spinal surgery a conversation starter." In the Academy's psychiatric wing, Zar'keth was making what the medical staff optimistically called progress. His spine had healed completely, his motor functions had returned to normal, and he had even begun speaking in complete sentences again. Unfortunately, the content of those sentences suggested that his personality had undergone what could only be described as a fundamental software update. "The humans," he said to Dr. Milaxara during his daily session, "are not what we thought they were." "And what did you think they were?" the psychiatrist asked, though she had heard this conversation 17 times in the past week. "Weak, fragile, inferior." Zar'keth's mandibles clicked with what might have been either amusement or existential terror. "We measured them by our standards: size, strength, natural armor, enhanced reflexes. We never considered that they might have different standards entirely." He paused, staring at the wall with the contemplative expression of someone who had experienced enlightenment through involuntary surgery. "Do you know what the truly frightening part is, Doctor?" "What's that, Zar'keth?" She was being gentle. Dr. Melixara made another note in her ever-expanding file on human-related psychological trauma, a field of study that had emerged entirely because of one small human's approach to conflict resolution. Meanwhile, Maya Chen had achieved something unprecedented in Academy history. She had become simultaneously the most feared and most respected cadet in the institution's 3-century existence. Other students spoke of her in whispers, using the kind of reverential tone usually reserved for natural disasters or religious experiences. Her combat instructors treated her with the careful respect one shows to unexploded ordnance, while her academic professors had stopped asking questions about human military doctrine entirely. "How are you finding your studies, Cadet Chen?" Instructor Vector asked during one of their carefully supervised interactions. "Really educational," Maya replied with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm learning so much about different species' combat capabilities. Did you know that most galactic civilizations consider it unsporting to target structural weak points during engagement?" Vector's 6 legs performed what could only be described as a nervous tap dance. "Is that unusual by human standards?" "Oh, completely," Maya said, apparently oblivious to the way Vector was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "Back home we call that basic tactical awareness. Our first rule of combat is fight to win. Everything else is just details." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the Academy's communication system. "Attention all personnel, Human Cadet Chen will be conducting advanced combat demonstrations in Training Bay 7. All non-essential personnel are advised to evacuate to minimum safe distance. Medical teams report to stations. May the gods have mercy on us all." Maya brightened at the announcement. "Oh good, advanced training. I've been looking forward to showing everyone some of the techniques we didn't cover in basic assessment." As she headed toward the training bay with the eager stride of someone about to share a particularly interesting hobby, Vector quietly updated his will and began composing what he hoped would not be his final incident report. The galaxy had discovered that humans were not the weak, primitive species they appeared to be. Instead, they were something far more terrifying, a species that had survived on a death world by treating violence as a casual social interaction and spinal surgery as a measured response to mild rudeness. And the truly frightening part, as Zar'keth had realized during his extended stay in the psychiatric wing, was that Maya Chen represented the gentle side of human nature. The Academy's new motto, hastily carved into the main entrance hall, read, "Strength through diversity, wisdom through experience, survival through adequate medical insurance." It was, Director Velshon reflected, probably the most honest institutional statement the Academy had ever made.